a topic to uncover, and very particular speaker, Sasha Starost, who is gonna present us her project. As I announced it today, it sounds a little bit nerdy, but at the same time it's aimed at very broad audience, because we all, I think, know a lot of memes about medieval times in many languages. They both are equally popular in Russian and in English, I guess. And it would be really interesting to understand how those medieval practices and narratives can be traced in the modern politics and policies of Russia in particular. And Sasha created a huge project that is hard to evaluate very quickly. We will try to do it in 45 minutes.
Yeah, or an hour, I guess. I will try to be as fast as possible.
Okay. But then Sasha offered this model and mode of interaction tonight. We would like to have a discussion, so please be prepared to ask questions, because it's going to be a very dense presentation, I think.
Yeah.
But it's very welcoming and open for a lot of questions, I guess, because it is aimed at engagement. So please be prepared, be brave. So, and yeah, please welcome Sasha.
Thank you. My name is Sasha Starost, and I'm an artist from Russia and an activist from Russia. And the first thing that I want to preface this by saying that we're not going to be talking about the Russian medieval times or like Middle Ages specifically. We're going to use Middle Ages as the reference, like a very generalized reference for a lot of things that are taking place in nowadays Russia. But I want you to pay attention that I'm using this reference as a symbol. I'm not saying that this is exactly what it is, okay? So I'm going to say a couple of words on like my previous activities and what I used to do in Russia. I used to engage in social political art and art activism, and specifically I was working a lot in the field of human rights for people with mental illnesses and neurodiversities as well. I am a diagnosed mental patient myself, and I'm the founder of the Psychoactive, which is the first Russian online and offline self-advocacy platform. But I'm also a musician. I worked as a director for plays. I did a lot of performances. I basically did just a lot of different stuff. But this is kind of irrelevant here for the talk, because we're going to concentrate on my very specific avatar as an aspiring, self-taught, like home-brewed kind of medievalist. And also once I was an active member of the Tolkien fandom, so I am a nerd. So this combined with like my experience in art and in living in Russia led to the birth of the project that we're going to discuss today. And I want to start off by saying that since the last iteration of this lecture, one very significant thing has happened, which is the mobilization. And we're obviously going to talk about the mobilization as well here a little bit. We're going to have a slide. We are going to be talking about our gaming project, which is like a narration game. It's basically the game with like branches and choices where you go through certain events and you read a lot of text and you see a lot of illustrations. And then you're making choices, and the game is based on the events that we have collected over the past 2 years. These are the events that we deem as feudal or like feudalistic, and they have literally actually happened in Russia. These are like political, cultural, social, economical events that we have chosen and collected. But everything is happening in this like kind of dark fantasy medieval setting, but people can still recognize the metaphor, and they're making choices, and then by the end of the game something happens. And what exactly, I'm going to tell you by the end of the lecture. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about. Also, I want to concentrate a little bit on the word feud itself and the name of the game, because it basically means like both just any kind of antagonism or opposition, or like a scandal or an argument. And also it means the land allotment in medieval history. So basically the land that belongs to the feudal lord. And Both of these ideas, in my opinion, are very important to our talk, and they are very good descriptors of certain processes in modern Russian politics. We are also going to be using terms neo-feudalism and neo-feudal to describe social, political, cultural, economical relationships in Russia. And the most important disclaimer for today is that this is not a political research. And I am not a political researcher. This is not a study. I'm not an economist. This is a lecture from an artistic person who does artistic stuff. And we're talking about the piece of art. So these are all symbols. And I think that it's very important to remember that whenever we're applying analogies, when we're using some metaphors, we have to always bear in mind and take into consideration that these are just, the works of our imagination. If you really want to see what's going on in Russia and understand how it works, you need to learn modern Russian history, not the Middle Ages, not anything else, not the fascist, like neo-Nazi or whatever, not neo, but just Nazi history, the history of Nazi Germany, for example, another very popular allegory and another very popular comparison. Okay, now I'm supposed to do it like that, I guess? Yeah, sure. Okay. So, the world has changed, several times actually, since the beginning of the war. And I think it's very important to bear in mind that this feudal thing that is going on in Russia and the way the country is structured in a very vertical way, and the way they're structuring their war activities right now are very much interrelated. We are going to get into that. We're going to get into the annihilation of modernity and how Putin literally fights the modern times and how he wants to trace everything back, how he wants to turn the time back, and why he does that. We didn't actually want to release the game after the war because we've been working on the game for the past 2 years, and when the war has started, we felt like it's definitely not the time for any kinds of games, and a lot of the oppositionary, the members of the oppositionary parties or just the activists were in complete and utter shock, and we were so heartbroken. Obviously, we didn't feel like, putting the plot of the war into the game would be okay, but we also felt like ignoring this thing is kind of not okay as well, so we just decided to start our game with the anti-war statement. And then after talking to a lot of people who have been listening to the concepts that we had, and they started kind of slowly convincing us that we still should release the game because it's very important in their opinion. I don't know if it is, but still. So Russia is your ultimate shittiest fantasy. And here's the concept that we're going to talk about. I'm introducing you to the term of popadantsy. So, popadantsy is a term in Russian internet lore that describes a certain type of low fantasy books where the plot revolves around a person traveling in time or between dimensions and is waking up in, say, Westeros while being a white-collar middle-class person from Moscow. And the whole ordeal, the thing that is happening to this person, how he experiences the changes in the world and how it's super tremendously different, is usually the core of the plot. And these are usually, like I said, low fantasy, bad written books. The core, the actual root of the word is to popast, to get somewhere. So popadantsy are the people who get somewhere suddenly without expecting to actually get there. And it's very interesting how in modern Russia, when we see the oppositionary leaders or just generally liberal people, they seem to be these popadantsy people because they seem to feel as if they literally woke up in a country that is completely totalitarian, super violent, and they just don't know how to handle that. So they have this very popular narrative that they keep reiterating, which is, we don't belong here, we don't know how we got here, and they keep on asking all of these questions how did that happen? What happened? Why are we living in such a country? But I believe that this is a huge mistake to think that this country suddenly has made a drastic turn and has changed into something completely different. This did not happen overnight, but it's very interesting how there is a huge disconnection that we're going to elaborate on later in the talk between the country as a whole and even like the people in power and those who consider themselves to be liberals or like oppositionary leaders, because they are literally like living in a separate parallel dimension where, for example, the democratic mechanisms or peaceful protests can work. Russia is very fragmented, and we're going to talk about this, and different regions, different cities it's not a unified country no matter how much it wants to make you believe that it is. And there are so many different social groups, and specifically people who subscribe to liberal ideas. It's not their fault that they are popadantsy. It's not because they're bad. It's not because they're white saviors or they have a certain privilege. Some of them do, obviously, others don't. They might come from poorer regions as well. It's just that they believe in things that don't work in Russia, don't necessarily work in Russia, because Russia as a governmental institutional structure, as an entity, is gradually becoming more and more radical, violent, and very anachronistic, dare I say. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So when these people realize that they're in the midst of the circumstances that they don't completely understand, and the problem with these people, me included, is that we keep applying the same methods to the process that just doesn't respond to these methods. For example, we're trying to influence the governments with peaceful protests, but the government only understands violence, and the government inflicts violence upon the protesters. But we don't know how to reply to that violence because we were trained to be peaceful. So this is when we feel like we don't belong here. And this is when we literally feel as if we woke up in Middle Ages and we don't recognize the surroundings. We were taught different things. And this is the result. Political amorphousness that a lot of people blame on Russians. And they say, you know, Russian people in general are very politically amorphous. And I guess you can say they are, but for all different reasons, depending on the group. So, for example, the liberals are not specifically, and the leftists, the Russian leftists, and any kinds of Russian like oppositionaries, they're not specifically politically amorphous. At least they don't think of themselves as such. But they become politically amorphous because no matter what they do, it doesn't have any result. You know what I'm saying? So eventually they get burnouts, they drop their activities, or they feel like it doesn't work. So another important thing, and here I'm going to need the script because I don't want to ramble too much. So why neo-feudalism, and what does that even mean? So neo-feudalism obviously is not a term that I have invented. It has been coined by so many different people, and it's very present in pop culture. A lot of people, a lot of media, a lot of different like artistic pieces are exploring the possibility of feudal or medieval, going back, returning. So I will just go through some of the options and views on the subject, and I'm not going to dwell on this for too long because there are a lot more examples than this. You can find them on the internet if you just Google neo-feudalism, you know, new Middle Ages and stuff like that. So Novalis really enjoyed, he's a philosopher and a romantic poet, a German romantic poet from the 19th century. He really enjoyed the idea of a very structured society that he really liked, and he really enjoyed the feudal part in like the sense of the smaller communities. So in the sense, he viewed the opportunity to go back to the Middle Ages as a good one, because he kind of saw this as, in a sense, a canton-like structure. A canton is like a regional structure that existed in Middle Ages in Switzerland, and it ended up with a very democratic country, so obviously sometimes it works. So for Novalis, it was a neo-feudalist utopia, obviously. Then there is a Russian philosopher, Berdyaev, who talked about the possibilities of a medieval turn in his work, The New Middle Ages, and it was a dystopian look. Political scientist Emanuel Wallerstein, in 1992, he was formulating 3 possible scenarios for the global development, basically, and one of them was called neo-feudalistic, and he described it as autarkic neo-feudalism, and like where the regions have their local hierarchies and they're like maintaining a sufficiently high level of technology and like the standard of living, but only for the elite. So he was talking about how neo-feudalism in the future could possibly combine the violent methods of like feudalism and the methods of capitalism. There is also a Russian historian under the name of Karamurza, it's his surname, and he was talking about, he was like analyzing the latest part of the Soviet era, the 80s and the 70s, and describing this as a neo-feudalistic structure, where he was talking about how the clans of certain people in the party were like interrelated, and they were granting each other the lands, the resources, and all the interactions that they had. This is another version of neo-feudalism, but what interests me the most in my work is one single phrase by the political scientist John Gray in his Enlightenment Wake. It's his work, in which he says that the Enlightenment project, this is a quote, has run its course, and we are in the dark ages that occur when the values of liberal democracy fail. So he was talking basically about the disappointment and even resentment that people might feel when the ideas of the Renaissance, the ideas of the value of human rights and like the anthropocentric model fail for whatever reason. I feel like it's very, very essential to the conversation we're having today, because this is exactly what happened in Russia. Liberalism kind of failed in Russia. And it's interesting, because people tend to think that it doesn't switch the slides. That's okay. So people tend to think that there was no liberalism in Russia, right? And a lot of the times when I bring this up as a subject, people go like, but Russia was never liberal. Like Russia had this like very strange like oligarchic structure in the 90s, and then it kind of slowly descended into totalitarianism again. But can you figure out maybe why the slides are not working? I just really feel uncomfortable.
Do you want me to stay here?
Yeah, sure. So, in all actuality, liberalism in Russia had an attempt to thrive, and it failed, and I'm gonna like get you through how exactly that happened. So Russia is running in circles. This is the thing. Russia is always like repeating its own history, which I guess is applicable to every other country, but it's just because I live in Russia and I see that. Well, in the 90s, we didn't particularly have an actual like liberalist utopia or even like a decent democratic country, but we had an attempt at a democratic plan. And the reason why it failed is for actually several reasons. First of all, because it happened right after the collapse of a huge country with a very specific inner structure. So as far as you know, USSR was like a socialist country, not a communist. That is important. I can see a lot of people from like English-speaking countries actually equaling socialism to communism and talking about how Russia was a communist country. It never was. We actually never had any communist countries in the world. And we don't have any communist countries to this day. But it was a socialist country, and of course it was structured, we didn't have any free market, for example. So a lot of the professions completely lost its meaning after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and people had to 100% restructure and reorganize their lives, which obviously was, you know, very complicated and energy consuming and time consuming. A lot of people died literally due to the like increase in crime rate and people trying to engage in like shadier activities to get the money and all of these kinds of things. So of course there was a lot of disappointment, and this disappointment was also associated with a very interesting period when there was the rise of the free press and free art and like free television and a lot of these great interesting things, because in this sense, for like the artistic community, for example, the 90s was like a thriving time. It was an amazing time. But people were struggling. It was the poorest time in the latest like modern history of Russia. So of course there's this association and people tend to get disappointed. And so I feel like it's very important what the intention is. The intention was to democratize the country, to make it more democratic basically, but it failed. Also, going back to the USSR, I feel like it's fair to say that USSR was in a sense an empire, even though it was a socialist country, and that sounds kind of contradictory, but in all, like actually it was. It inherited a lot of the territories of the former Russian Empire, but it even expanded these territories with the center in Moscow. It was still a very centralized country, And even though it was not like an ethnical empire, which means that those in power were not just Russians, not ethnically Russians necessarily, like for example, Stalin wasn't ethnically Russian, he was Georgian. And everybody who was subscribing to the idea and to the ideological narrative was able to join the ruling classes, but it still was an empire. It still was a very centralized, a very totalitarian, and a very like ruled from the center type of country with like colonial types for certain republics, colonial types of ruling for certain republics. So there's a thing which is called Germania Magna. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. It is actually a Latin term, and it describes the Holy Roman Empire, which is the German iteration of the Roman Empire that has appeared after the collapse of the original Great Roman Empire. It has appeared on the originally Germanic territories that were once conquered by the Romans. You have probably seen this video by Rammstein, Deutschland. Basically, this video is the first part of it, where you see this black woman like cutting the head from the Roman legionnaire. It describes the situation when the Romans lose the territories of Germania Magna, and Germania basically like appropriates the label. So the Holy Roman Empire was created on the remnants of the Great Roman Empire. And it inherited a lot of things as the legacy of the empire, and this is exactly what happened to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we are living on the remnants of the collapsed empire because Soviet Union is not Russia. This is also very important. Russia was a huge country even prior to the Soviet Union. It was big enough to be considered a colonial country itself, because even like the original territory of Russian Empire was already colonial. It had a lot of colonial territories. But it is still smaller than Soviet Union. And despite the fact that they have chosen the title language and they have placed the capital in Moscow, still, like I said, the rules of the ruling were kind of different. Like it was not an ethnical empire. So Russia was not, like USSR was not all about Russia. So Russia had to reconstruct and reinvent itself after the collapse. And it's important to understand this because Putin always tries to exploit the idea of the USSR. And basically he drags any kind of idea that fancies him. Like if he sees it as useful, he's going to drag all of these ideas and like put them into the ideological narrative that he's promoting. And one of the ideological narratives is the resentment, and the second one is like nostalgia for the USSR, especially amongst the older generation. And we have to bear in mind that it's just not true. Okay, so the question of the day, is Putin literally Hitler? It's a comparison that I feel is very important to be distinguished, and it is another reason why we're talking about the feudal thing more than the fascist or Nazi or neo-Nazi thing. I think that calling Russia a fascist or authoritarian regime is just not enough, because there are a lot more facets to how it operates. I also believe that the ideological system is not at all that straightforward, and it's not very well thought, and I even doubt that there is an ideological system per se, and we're going to talk about why I believe in that. If you really, like I said, want to learn more about how modern Russia operates, the thing you need to do is just learn modern Russian history, not like the analogical, metaphorical kinds of like comparisons that you might come up with. But I also believe that one very important signature trait of the Putin's Russia gets left out when we're talking about the fascist regime or the neo-Nazi regime. It's the clans or the greater houses, or like the personal interactions between the people whom Putin granted their resources, their titles, their everything, which is a very feudalistic, feudal, medieval, whatever you want to call it, trait. Now, if you Google neo-feudalism as a governmental/institutional formation, state formation, you're going to see that in the related articles, it has the mafia government and the mafia state. And it is not a coincidence. Actually, these things operate very similarly. There's the thing which is called familialism. It is a term coined by one of the Italian researchers whose name I don't really remember. But he was talking about how in the south of Italy, where people favored fascism very much, they were also very familial. So they had all of these familial ties that they felt as more important than, you know, the overall societal community ties. So they would favor familial ties above everything else. And this is also a trait of a very, I would say, well, I don't want to say like underdeveloped society, but like it is a specific trait. Let's just leave it at that. Okay, so we have the great houses, and we're going to talk about these great houses and how like we have certain clans and certain castes in Russia and how they operate. Then again, like I said, the power in the country is very centralized, or at least it is trying to be centralized, but then there is always this constant struggle undercover. These people are constantly fighting with one another and trying to grab power from one another, which is very Game of Thrones-ish, if you will. So mafia is feudalism, kind of, maybe. And the last thing that I want to say is that a lot of people keep speculating of whether Putin is crazy, and if you have ever, like, obviously you didn't, because I don't think you watch Russian oppositionary channels, but amongst these Russian oppositionary channels, a very, very popular kind of outlook on whatever's going on there is that Putin is just mad. You know, Vlad is mad, he's not okay, he's not right in the head, and this is why he's doing all of that thing. This is why he started the war, which is obviously not benefiting him. I don't think so. I think it's very unwitty, actually, to believe that somebody who has so much power and who has gathered so much power over their past, like, 20 years is just crazy. I think he has a plot and he has an idea, and we're going to talk about his idea. So, okay. That requires a little bit of an explanation. So lawlessness is a generic term, but if you have ever heard of the jargonisms that appear in prisons, in Russian prisons there's an argot. Argot is the language that people use in prisons, and it's like very hard to understand for somebody who is an outsider or has never been to prison. It's basically like a vernacular version of like regular Russian, but like a very it's a version that is specific to prison particularly. And there's this word bespredel, which basically means lawlessness, but if you were speaking regular Russian, you would never say bespredel, especially like in a formal setting. You would say something like беззаконие maybe, right? And this is a picture from the movie Беспредел, which is obviously about a prison, and like this is a character that is very infamous and famous both at the same time among Russian internet users, and they use him as a meme. We're going to talk about the lawlessness and how it operates in Russia. So there's another term that I want you to get familiarized with. And the term is OCG, or OPG in Russian. It's very hard to switch between two types of thinking and talking. So OCG is an organized criminal group. And a lot of the times when people are talking about Putin and the people in power, they literally call it Putin's OCG, or like Putin's organized criminal group, which it can trace us back to the question of mafia. And there's some truth to this saying. It also kind of like adds to the whole narrative. But if you really look at this from the feudal point of view, you know, there's always like there's the lord or the king, and who's like, he's the one who gathers the lands, he's the one who's responsible for everything, and he's also the one who grants everything for those who serve under his banners. And if you look at the like structure of the Russian government, and those who are in power are responsible for certain policies, these people serve under his banners, and a lot of the times these people are literally his acquaintances since the times when he was not a president, like since his early childhood, since his younger ages, like teenage years or something. And sometimes they literally cannot even do the job they are subscribing for, because they're only given these positions because they're in close touch with the president, not because they have certain talents or capacities. And this is also very, well, like it's not really democratic, obviously, but it's not even exactly totalitarian, because the point is not even to serve the regime. The point is to grant certain people with certain things to buy their loyalty, okay? And also these people like committing crimes together, you know, just like in a mafiosi group. because it ties people together and it's a bond that you cannot break. If you know that you have killed a number of people together with this person and he also granted you this wonderful castle somewhere in Italy and then he got you this position, so everything that you have basically depends on this person, it is very hard to break the ties, okay? All right. So there's another funny thing that medieval lords' activities, like from the point of view of the criminal code, it kind of fits under the article of robbery and several other articles, which I don't remember, but like, yeah, if you really compare the mafiosi approach and the feudal approach, there's a lot in common. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the It's okay. I mean, that's going to be repeating, I guess. We're going to talk a little bit about the ideology, and it is a bold statement, but I do believe that Russia doesn't have any ideology, per se, like a strict ideology, at least formally. So ideology is usually bigger than the leader. So what are some of the, I'm probably even going to ask you a question, what are some of the ideologies that you are familiar with? I'm asking the question. Okay. Human rights. Human rights is not an ideology. It's an idea that human life is valuable. So do you understand the difference between the idea and the ideology? So ideology is the set of ideas that can like eventually end up in this very like solid structure that tends to explain the world around you. For example, okay, how many of you are leftists? Can you raise your hands? Okay. So leftism is actually an ideology, just like every kind of right ideology. Ideology is a set of beliefs, is a system of beliefs. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But it has to be coherent and comprehensive to explain the world. So it's funny how when people talk about ideologies, a lot of the times they consider that ideology is necessarily a bad label. So if you want to coin something as ideological, you're basically saying it's bad, it should be thrown out in the garbage. That's not the case. Every kind of like structured and well thought set of political beliefs is an ideology. But I think this is something that we are lacking, particularly in what's going on in Russia right now. So leftism is an ideology, socialism, Marxism, any kinds of right or centrist movements. Orthodox Christianity even can be considered an ideology. Or maybe, for example, fundamentalism, or what else? Like, I'm just thinking, Juche in North Korea, for example, a set of ideological rules. Nazi Germany, again, like the Nazi doctrine is obviously an ideology. But Russian ideology doesn't really explain anything more, it just disorients people. So if you are at least a little bit familiar with like Russian TV propaganda, you have probably noticed how they like throwing contradictory statements, sometimes even in the same speech, which creates this very interesting mindset in a person who watches this regularly. A person just starts getting completely astray and lost without any opportunity.
So sorry to interrupt, keep wiggling the mouse and then it'll come off.
Oh yeah?
Wiggling, yeah, just wiggle it.
Oh, so I need to do it like that, okay.
Just occasionally.
I'm gonna just fiddle the diddle. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so I think that Russian propaganda is very contradictory, and it's kind of mixed. It has a lot of different facets that do not really go well together, and I believe that this is intentional for a number of reasons. First of all, because by disorienting people, you deprive them from the possibility of analyzing what's going on. So if you have an ideology, you can at least use this lens to look at things through the lens. Like, for example, intersectional feminists have their lens, which helps them operate in the world. Alt-rights have their lens, which helps Ben Shapiro operate in his world. And they can both, you know, make coherent political steps. But Russian citizens usually can't. The second thing is that ideology is usually bigger than the leader. So for example, Juche or the socialist USSR-ish ideology, when the leader dies, when Stalin died, USSR did not collapse because it was not centered particularly around this person. The person can be even like overthrown. For example, with Stalin, there was this like de-Stalinization process, but it didn't lead to the collapse of the country. Okay. Then I feel like there's a difference between the ideology and the idea. Because idea could be personal. Like, for example, I can believe in a thing that could be completely contradictory. But it's my idea that drives me and makes me do certain things, and it's very important for me. And I can even have a delirious idea. But if I'm a president, for example, what if I have this kind of idea and I try to enforce it on everyone else? And I believe that this is exactly what's going on. There's no particular ideology, but there's an idea like a messianistic messiah complex sort of kind of idea, not only for Putin, but also for Russia in general as an entity. Russia is its own civilization. Russia has its own path. Russia is the last traditional country in Europe, the last traditional white country. All of these things, you know, are tied to so many things. So, okay. It's very hard to, you know, be in two processes at once. Okay, so Ivan Ilyin is a philosopher from the first wave of Russian immigration. He ran from the Bolshevik Revolution. He can be considered a very radical right philosopher, and also he's very much into this whole Russia is a separate civilization kind of thing. And some people say that he is a huge influence, like his works were a huge influence on Putin, and that Putin even bought his personal library, you know, to get closer to his ideal way. And I believe that this is what we should bear in mind. Like there is, the king has an idea basically. It's not that there is an ideological set of rules, but there are two very important things. One, disorient the people so that they get as far from politics as possible. Two, you know, enforce your idea. War on words. I don't know if you're familiar with how the Russian government and the Russian propaganda operates the words, how they call the war the special operation, and now the mobilization thing is called the partial mobilization, which is not true, and everybody knows it's not. But for whatever reason, I don't know if anyone read Ursula Le Guin, where she has this concept of the original actual names that you're not supposed to disclose to anyone else. So for example, my name is Sasha for everyone who doesn't know me very well, but then I have the original actual magical name that nobody except for me knows. Because if I say this name and if somebody else gets to know this name, they can basically control me and, you know, make me do certain things because it has magical power. I feel it's very well reflected in the way Russian government tends to react to Navalny, for example, because they would always try to avoid calling Navalny by the name. And it has a historical, folklore kind of comparison. So in traditional lore of the majority of European countries, Russia included, for the Slavs is just the same as for the rest of the Europeans. We were trying to avoid certain words because we didn't want the invocation to happen. For example, we wouldn't label the devil. We had a lot of different words. Or the fairy folk, for example. Like the little people, all the kind people, the good people, all of these, the good neighbors, all of these euphemisms, because we can't say that these are the fairies, otherwise the invocation might happen and they might come and do something to us, so we don't want to attract their attention. I feel like when they're labeling war the special operation, the underlying idea is that if you don't call this, it doesn't come to Russia, and Russian people will not realize that what's going on is actually war. And then with Navalny, obviously Navalny is the personification of the possibility of a revolution, so you don't label him, you don't call him by the name. He's like the local political devil. So radioactive ash and the eschatological perspective. So Russian propagandists love to talk about the nuclear war. They are rambling about it constantly. And surprisingly, they're very happy about this, the perspective. I mean, I'm not sure if they actually are, but this is a very medieval perspective because what people don't really understand about the eschatological pictures and the apocalyptic pictures is that In the medieval times, people were actually looking forward to the apocalypse. Because after the apocalypse, there's 1,000 years of the rule of Christ, and then, the best happens, So since life was terrible, plague, death, violence, all of these kinds of things, people were not really dwelling in their bodies and the present. They were looking forward to the heavenly life, So when they're talking about all of these like apocalyptic perspectives and they're so hyped and they're so happy, it really looks very medieval. It very like cultish, borderline cultish, we can say, if we're looking at this from the modern perspective. But for a medieval person, this is completely okay to, to perceive it like that. Of course, apocalypse is a good thing. It's a lot better than like your actual life if you're a peasant, for example. Now, personal interactions is something I have already touched upon, like all of these personal interactions in the corridors of the power, the government, stuff like that. Law is for the enemies, exactly. For example, Russia like nominally has laws, but just like in medieval times, law only exists for the peasants. It doesn't exist for like the royalties. And yeah. Yeah. But with like, then again, brothers in arms, those that went to the crusade together, those that went to the same gym together, for example. They get everything. And we still need the infamous opium for the people. So the church has a heavy influence and they're trying to make it even heavier. I mean, you have to bear in mind that Russia is still a modern country with a lot of popadantsy, people who still, go online and they read oppositionary articles and they, go to chat rooms and forums and they discuss all of these things. They even have registered accounts on Reddit. So it's kind of harder to, kind of pull it off in Russia than in, for example, North Korea, because it's not that isolated. Like you look at me, I don't look like somebody who crawled from under the rock. Like, so, but they're trying to make church an influence. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. And of course, religion and tradition as a unifying factor, because Russia is a fragmented country. It's so fragmented, you can't even imagine. But there is a problem. Russia forces the world into medievalism. So Russia has a lot of vassals, and you can read more on the conflicts of Russia on the neighboring territories. For example, here in Georgia, there's one. Then there's Pridnestrovia. The plot, the scheme is usually the same as on the territories of Ukraine. Why they're doing that? They're destabilizing the region in order to gain control over the region via the vessel of Russian-speaking people. And this is a very feudal concept. Like, I mean, I don't think it's surprising, conquering the lands and trying to grab the lands from your neighbors and trying to, maybe even like seed the seeds there in order to destabilize the region via these seeds, like the Russian-speaking people that are residing there, sometimes even against their will. Like it's nothing new on one hand, but on the other hand, it's a very specific thing. So we live in a multiverse setting. What I mean by that is that the world is not equal, and we literally live in different time frames. So for example, everybody is talking about the war in Ukraine. And in my suspicion, it is because war in Ukraine is happening almost in the center of Europe. And it is also happening to the white people just like ourselves. So for example, wars in Iraq or the Kurdistan situation. Not so many people are even familiar with. And it's because, when we're looking at these people almost living in their medieval ages all the time, we don't really, I'm not saying we in order to unify us in this like abhorring situation. I'm just saying that it's just the way it works. For a lot of us coming from the Western or even Eastern European world, even countries like Russia, it is so far away. And when we see these people, we don't recognize ourselves. And we have like ways to overcome this, but in a sense, we are living in different like timelines. And this is bad, and this is pretty colonial, actually. Okay. Why are we afraid of Putin? I guess for the same reason, because he can like just wipe out the whole territory of Europe and just kill all the people there. And it's very close to our hearts, especially to our hearts, people from Eastern Europe. We understand how close it is, and we are from the very epicenter of this. So, I am, so, it's hard to ignore. But it's also interesting how Ukrainian leaders, for example, are appropriating this language that he uses. For example, so okay, there was Kiev and Rus, the original feudal medieval Russian structure. Then the Mongols came, and then the I don't know how to say that properly in English, Muscovite, whatever, Rus with the center in Moscow has been created. And the the second Rus with the center in Moscow was created under the rule of Mongolians already. But it was not created by Mongolians. It is important to understand that this was the conquest, you know. They came, it was the horde, how they were labeled as, you know, referred to in Russia. They settled there, they were like, you know, usurping Russian people, Slavic people, and they were never really like in any close contact with the Slavic institutions and like things in power, but they were present there. Like, so basically they just occupied this territory for a very long period of time, for 300 years particularly. And the thing that is being widely discussed in Ukrainian media and like on Ukrainian channels right now is how this is the fight between Kievan and Moscovian Rus. Who is going to be like, who's going to take the heritage of the original Rus? So this is the fight for the Slavs. This is the fight for who is going to be the actual Slavs. And this is very medieval because first of all, this thing happened like some 1,000 years ago. And when we're having this war, which is very modern, it's happening right now. And like the authority figures are literally discussing Kievan Rus and the heritage of Kievan Rus and how Kiev is a Russian city, no, Kiev is a Ukrainian city. So Ukrainians are the real Russians. It's complicated, but like, you know, because it's Rus. So the word Russians should not belong to Russians. It probably should belong to Ukrainians because, and all of these things, you know, they're discussing all of these things and they're fighting over all of these things, and it's getting more and more important day after day, which means, in my opinion, that Russia kind of medievalizes the world around itself. The same with Serbia, for example, or the thing with the conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan right now, you know, the new kind of cycle of this conflict. It's as if people are waking up and like, oh, these people are fighting. I guess we can also, you know, try to engage in something like that. And it's very bad. And of course, Russia might fall under its weight, but the world has already become infected with the medieval bacillus, or at least the closer world, which I think is very problematic. The ties of the inner circle. Okay, so another important thing that people discuss, and of course, it is a thing that bothers a lot of people who are somehow related to the political circles of Russia, is what is going to happen when the king dies, if he ever dies. And he is going to, of course. The thing is, who is going to be the heir? But Putin is not looking for the heir because it doesn't bother him. Like in a lot of these cases, the only thing that bothers him is to stay alive, safe and secure with all that he has, all of his resources. And of course, there is now, after the beginning of war, the future is very vague and very cloudy, and now even more than ever, because in my opinion, it was such a misstep, such a bad decision to start the war. But I mean, I'm not somebody who can actually call Putin and say it was a bad decision. But in my particular opinion, I believe that the regime could have stayed in its very rigid condition for the next, like, whatever, 5, 6, 7 years until Putin is alive, and maybe even prolong itself to the time after his death, if not for the war. Because the war has put everything upside down and people are getting more and more nervous. So I feel like feudalism, conquest, and all of these crusades are going to be the end of maybe even Russia, or at least Russia as we know it, and it's all his fault. So, like I said, Thomas Hobbes was right. It's the war of all against all. And this is a very important concept in Russia that I think we should also kind of explain a little bit. What I mean by that is, remember I was talking about how Russia is a very fragmented country. It is a scattered country. It doesn't have no unity. First of all, we have a lot of different nations. These nations, ethnicities, some are minor, some are bigger. But these ethnicities don't have any representation. It's not that they're prohibited specifically to learn their language, but nobody cares. And if you really want to promote your language or promote your ethnical interests, it is very problematic and extremely dangerous to do in Russia, because Russia is striving to be an empire. But it is not an empire. And the thing is that in all of these different regions, there are all of these different powers that sometimes are not even willing to obey Moscow. Because they feel that there's it's like in every feudal system, everything is scattered, and yes, they kind of nominally obey sometimes because it's better for them to march under these exact banners. But when they have an opportunity, they will say, we don't give a flying, because this is another part of Russia, another territory, and literally a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, who once had a conflict with FSB, and he's an activist. He was working in the labor unions, which is also a very dangerous job in Russia. And while he had his interrogation, he said, well, I'm going to call to Moscow and tell everyone what you're doing here. And it was in Omsk, which is in Siberia, so it's a town that is very, very far away. And the FSB officer basically told him, who cares about Moscow? We're in Omsk, so we have different powers here. The war of all against all also happens on the activist level, with all of these different feminist groups, different liberals against centrists. People can't get together even now. People keep blaming each other. Now we have a new division, those who left and those who stayed. Now there's another division, those who left in February and those who left in September. And all of these people keep getting at each other's throats and fighting each other and having all of these stupid, silly arguments. And I think that fragmentation and atomization is a very important feature of Russian society. So I'm not going to touch upon the personal interest. We've reiterated this a couple of times already. And of course, Russia dreams of absolutism, but it's not yet there. It is a scattered country that is striving to become the monarchy, in my opinion. In my symbolic picture, it is a feudal country that is trying to become a monarchy. So Putin wanted to secure his position with the war, but I believe what he did was just the opposite. And the throne is trembling. The study. So everything we have already talked about, but now we're moving on to another important subject, and this is the castes that we have in Russia. And of course, like I said, this is just my perception, but we obviously have, who's familiar with the so-called castes in the medieval society, like those who fight, those who work, those who pray. We do have, of course, we don't have the strict caste because, it's a postmodern neo-feudalist structure, even if it is. And obviously, we don't literally have peasants, even though we're moving closer to that with mobilization. But we certainly have those who fight that are very, very important. They are intrinsic to this whole system. We call them siloviki. It derives from the origin of the word. The root of the word is sila. Sila is power. And basically, it's an umbrella term for different groups of people, for the security/military services, for the soldiers, the army. And that's pretty much, and the intelligence services as well. So the FSB is also under this umbrella. We have governmental corporations and businesses, government-related businesses that have affiliations with governmental structures. So Putin likes to talk about how we used to have so many oligarchs back in the 90s and how we got rid of all of them, but it's completely untrue. He has created his own, he has breeded out his own oligarchs that are just very dependent on him, but these people, the traders, they exist and they're they're thriving. It's just that they're tied to these governmental contracts that do not allow them to step out. Putin is a Silovik himself. He is from FSB. And I guess that, it's important that this is the real power. The real power in the country is this huge network of the silovые структуры. A lot of the times they're the ones who benefit. And I feel I'm going to tell you later why I feel like it's very medieval, but I guess you are familiar that if you're in the those who fight kind of community, you have more opportunities for social lifts in the actual medieval times. Another important feature is how our thinking when we're talking about politics is very, very magical. So power in Russia is sacred to a certain extent. And what I mean by that is it's completely illogical, irrational, and hard to understand. Which means that we don't know what happens in the so-called corridors of Kremlin. It is very darkened, very vague. Nobody really knows how the decisions are being made. And citizens aren't even a real thing anyway. So citizens have no rights, but they aren't even a real thing. What I mean by that is that people think they are citizens. People think that they are living in a country that, acts according to the rules of a modern country. You have the passport, you have the citizenship, but who cares about your votes? Who cares about your protests? Who cares about whether you want to go to war or not? Nobody, because the structure is so horizontal. So vertical, I'm sorry. It's so vertical that it looks like a damn tower where there's something here and then all the rest of the people are here like down the hill. They're not even in front of the tower. So they see them sometimes from the tower, but they never interact with these people and they don't even deem it as necessary. They don't believe that they should interact with these people. So another concept is the Potemkin village of Russia, which is basically another way to say the decoration. I believe that the trickiest thing about Putin's regime and its feudal nature is how we don't really see how feudal or, autocratic it is. Because, for example, take North Korea. You enter this country and you immediately see that this is a totalitarian country. You have dudes from intelligence services that are like following you everywhere and they don't allow you to travel across the country alone. You have the citizens that are afraid to even whisper a word to you because they don't even know if that's allowed. You have all of these like people stuck in the 50s with their strange clothing, lack of internet, all of these things. You know where you are. With Russia, go to Moscow. What you're going to see is a wonderful, amazing European city. Prior to war, with McDonald's, Starbucks, all sorts of food delivery, one of the best food in Europe actually. It's true. Like I'm in Georgia right now and food delivery here is a lot worse. And so you have all of these opportunities, all of these people in fancy clothing, like the hipster kids. They are so, at the same time, they were born and raised to be so alienated from politics, like we have already talked previously, how the propaganda and the television makes politics completely incomprehensible. It's hard to understand what they're talking about. So you either subscribe to their ideas or you just alienate yourself from politics and you go like, politics is not for us. We're youngsters. We're partying. We're doing our stuff. Politics is for the people in weird suits where they're shaking each other's hands and talking about some random stuff. And you don't see Russia for what it is. So the reason why we made this game was funny because we thought that as much as usually all of the medieval settings are very escapist, for Russia, it's actually quite the opposite because the medieval is not the decoration. The decoration is modernity. You live in a country where you believe that you live in a modern country, but you really don't. And like the popadantsy thing, again, going back to the lawyers and human rights defenders and activists, when you call the lawyer and you say, we're going to have protests tomorrow, can you please instruct me on what we're supposed to do? And the lawyers are like, I don't know, like according to the law, you can do this and this and this, but the police can completely ignore that. They may just don't care. And for example, when you're working on a play or a performance and you're having this talk with your local lawyer or your friend who's a lawyer and you're like, okay, so here's the preface, this is what is going to take place, this is how what it's going to look like. Is it potentially dangerous because it's about, for example, Russian prisons and the tortures in Russian prisons? And they're like, well, technically it's legal, but it's illegal because we know that nobody wants to talk about the tortures. So they're gonna come and they're probably gonna detain you. And could it result in a criminal case? According to the law, it can't, but who cares about the law? So, there's always this nominal level, and then there's another level, which is the hardcore truth. And everybody is aware of the hardcore truth. But the problem with a lot of these human rights activists is that they keep on living as if they can implement these modern democratic mechanisms in a country like Russia. The world is so small, it's actually uncanny. I'm talking about the way a medieval person perceives the world, how usually for a medieval peasant, it's the world is kind of shrinking down to the village or a couple of villages or the people they know. And just like people in Russia, they don't really even imagine the possibility of the contact with the Lord in terms of I am the citizen, and I have my rights. That's not the kind of conversation these people might be having. So for a lot of Russian citizens who are not involved in political activities, who are not activists, it's just the same. It's just a very small world. Politics is impenetrable. You don't know what's going on there, and you should not even dare to try to learn because, you know, it's A, dangerous, B, dirty, which is also another thing that they taught us. Politics is dirty, yet they're doing it, but like, that's not for us. Yeah, and like I said, the system will likely kill Russia. What's going to happen in post-empire, God knows. An important thing, during the war, there is like all of the national ethnical movements are on the rise in Russia. Buryats against war, for example. The region that has suffered greatly from the war because originally they have sent thousands and thousands of Buryats to war. It is funny, you know, Russia, like I said, is very fragmented. So it is very different even in terms of timelines. For example, Moscow and St. Petersburg is a lot closer to modern times, to modernity in general. But for example, regions like Ulan-Ude, where primarily inhabited by Buryat people, is a very poor region. So what they do is they do not, originally before the mobilization, they didn't send Russian people from Moscow or St. Petersburg to war. Instead, they sent people from these poorest regions. And why did they do that? Well, because, like I said, it's a social lift. And for example, if you see somebody who is helping the knight in a medieval society to go about their business, and then he has an opportunity to be promoted to the knight, right? And then this is why people go and they enter these silovые структуры in Russia. Because, you know, once you're a policeman, you can probably climb up the ladder, you know, and this is, you know, it's funny, but really, literally, there's one moment in the Game of Thrones where I think Littlefinger says that chaos is a ladder, and like Russian political system is very chaotic, but there is a ladder. If you enter the silovые структуры, you know, it gets kind of more understandable. Now we're moving on to the question of church, and we're going to talk about what's been coined as the conservative turn. So the situation in Russia was not always like that. And even in 2009 and 2010, it was very different. And even there's this joke about different Putins, how Putin has, you know, 10 or 7 clones, and how they're also different in terms of their policies, and how there was the original democratic Putin, and then he was killed off, and then the other Putin came. So in the times of the first Putin, on the surface, Russia was a very free country still. It was okay to live there unless you were kind of like entering the fields that are completely prohibited and like poking your nose to where it doesn't belong. But after that, we have, you know, suffered and underwent the thing that is now labeled as the conservative turn. So when asking the question in the role of the church in the conservative turn, a lot of the times what we see is that it is, yes, huge, but also there are some inner tensions within the Russian Orthodox Church, which I think is very interesting because it's very medieval as well. All of these like inner tensions and sects and cults and like blasphemous against not blasphemous and the canon. So is it really a conservative turn? Meaning that, is it really the turn promoted by the Orthodox Church? Because this conservative turn is heavily relying on the so-called traditional values, and you have probably heard about that, and they're talking a lot about like the church and fundamentalist values, and we're gonna see how that works. I'm going to touch a little bit upon how church and war, like this is not just your random church, this is the church of the Ministry of Defense. Yes, they have built the church in honor of the Ministry of Defense, which is kind of blasphemous, I guess, but if you really think about how medieval churches as an institution, medieval church participated in the Crusades, and like, you know, the concept of the fair war against the unfair war was heavily promoted by the church, so it's nothing new really. An almost secular country. So we have been a secular country and even like an atheist country for 80 years. And then in the 90s, people started remembering God. People were super obsessed with the, in the 90s, it's important, people were super obsessed with the concept of the Russian Empire. And they started criticizing the Soviet Union and the experience of the Soviet Union. So naturally, they turned to all of the archetypes from the Russian Empire, including Russian Orthodox Christianity. And there was like the rise of sects in the 90s, including Christian sects, such as, for example, the sect called Tsaribozhniki. I will try to translate it. So Tsaribozhniki is basically people who believe that Tsar Nicholas II was actually like almost the reincarnation of Christ, and that he also like died for our sins, like for the sins of the people. And the people betrayed him because the people, they pledged like allegiance to the king, to the Tsar, and then they betrayed him and let him be killed off, and that, you know, he will return and that he is among the saints. And this is completely blasphemous from the like point of view of the Canaan Christianity, like the Orthodox Church Christianity, but nonetheless, this is a thing. The church and the king, obviously, in our case, has a lot of relationships. Both are institutionalized, like the government and the church. And some people even say that Russian Orthodox Church is an organized crime group as well. So РПЦ это ОПГ. War interests, we have touched upon this already. Now it's interesting how we are moving on to the reverse pyramid. So the Tsaribozhniki sect has, everything that I'm going to say in this section is an assumption, but there are a couple of documentaries, including one very interesting one from the Dozht. What is Dozht? Is it like a TV channel or? Yeah, it's an oppositionary TV channel. Okay. So Dozht in its research, in its video, speculates that Tsaribozhniki have infiltrated the Russian Orthodox Church, and that they have a lot of the relationships with very public and very important and very powerful figures amongst the Siloviki circles. And this is really nothing new. We're going to talk a little bit about the Manichaean sects. So the Manichaean sects, it's from the actual medieval history. The most infamous Manichaean sect is Cathars, that were super popular and influential in France. But what people don't really remember is that the Cathars came from Bulgaria, and they came to Bulgaria from Persia. So Persia is the country of Zoroastrism. So Zoroastrism is a separate kind of religion, a philosophical system. Some people say it's a philosophical system, some say it's a religion. But what is important is that Zoroastrism is a dualistic religion, which means that in Zoroastrism, like God created everything heavenly, devil created everything earthly. And it has been transferred onto the Orthodox and Christian concepts via these sects that came from Persia to Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, they were called Bogomili. But it's the same sect as the Cathars, and basically it's, first of all, an eschatological sect, that believes in the close apocalypse. And secondly, the sect that believes in the dualism. So everything on the earth is dirty and sinful, and we should not really pay any attention to the earth. In Russia, the turning point for the church and its influence happened, I guess, in the case of Pussy Riot, where we were explicitly demonstrated as the country that you should not do anything like that, never ever again. This is very dangerous. You should go to jail, regardless of how many famous and rich people are going to step out in your favor and how many Madonnas are going to sing their songs to support you. Okay? Church is sacred, but we have these tensions because some people who've been working as journalists have noticed that a lot of these very important figures who were behind the Pussy Riot case, who were behind the case of Matilda, which is a very famous movie about the lover of Russian Tsar Nicholas II, those people who were trying to, like, they were creating these attacks on culture, they were trying to ban all of these things, ban all of these movies. People who are responsible for that are not actually Russian Orthodox believers, but Tsaribozhniki within the circles of Russian Orthodox Church. Some people even say that the confessor of Putin himself is Tsaribozhnik, but it has not been proven. And we know for sure that there is this woman, her name is Poklonskaya, she was in the government, and she was Tsaribozhnitsa. But then she was removed from the governmental circles. I'm sorry. Yeah. and she's no longer there. Why? I guess because Putin deems everything as utilitarian, like if it's, you can utilize that, you use it. And the tensions within the church undermine the possibilities of church to get super institutionalized and get more power. I think this is the reason, while I'm not obviously a specialist, but I believe that this is interesting and important. And basically, if we're looking back at the history, it's like there's nothing new. The church doesn't do anything to control the process of like the invasion of sects, probably because they have a lot of influential guards in the silovi structures. Those who fight support, and those who fight have the most money and the most resources. I also feel like it's important that Russia is kind of a reconstruction society in a sense, because like I said, Putin likes to play with the idea of turning back time. And in this sense, turning time as far back as before the schism of the churches is, well, kind of a megalomaniac, but an interesting idea. And also there has always been the dichotomy of institution versus true faith. So with the Cathars, it was just like that. The super rich lords were giving their children, their resources, their money to the Cathars, and the Cathars even at some point had their own army that fought the army of France. So there was a huge, like before they were completely wiped out of the territory of France, there was this huge tension between the Catholic Church and the sect. We don't want to step on this level, obviously, so the people, the representatives of Tsaribozhniki sect just keep on infiltrating the Orthodox Church, and I guess they have some level of influence there. We can speculate, again, it's a speculation, whether or not they are the influence behind the at least some parts of the conservative turn when it comes to the influence of the church. So maybe it is their turn, maybe it's not the Orthodox Church.
Could you explain again what you meant by Russia as a reconstruction society?
I mean, Russian, okay. I feel like they're role-playing constantly. So when I look at Putin and all of these people with their traditional values and their like conquests and all of these references that they keep on making, they're always referencing these very old times, the old ways. And Putin compares himself with Peter the Great. He compares himself with Ivan the Terrible. Look, and it feels as if, you know, I'm in some role play community. Like it's strange, but these people are trying to reconstruct something and force everyone else to play in their role play, but nobody else wants to. Like, I mean, some people do, but there's, how many people are there in Russia? Like 140 million people forced to be at some convention that Putin has created, and like, it's not funny. It is funny, but it's also not funny because, I don't know, maybe someone else can, someone who's from Russia, like these two people, maybe you can add, because I guess you understand what I'm saying. Natasha.
Yeah, I think
And here's the thing, yeah, like it's interesting because when we, for example, see how much attention Putin pays to the idea of the outer influence, and then how he also favors these people from this particular sect that inherits the sects that were first created before the schism of the churches. Have you heard about the schisms? So there were several schisms. The first one was the one that has created the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, and then within the Orthodox Church there was the thing in Russia which is labeled as the Niconian Schism, after Nikon, and it's the schism that has created the old believers and the new believers, and the old believers were like heavily prosecuted and they were oppressed. But also all of these sects that are dualistic, they trace back to the old believers. So when Putin favors these people and also talks, this is a complete like conspiracy theory here from me, and we're going to get back on track, I promise. But when I hear how he favors these people and how he gives them an opportunity to voice themselves, I feel like he really wants to bring back not the Soviet Union, but the 1654, like the before the schism time, because this is when the church and the country was sort of kind of isolated from even the neighboring countries, and like the influence craze that Putin is suffering from. the influence, the infiltration via the church, via the television, via the art, everything, you know. So there is something about this. The demonomania, which is a very prominent feature of every medieval society, of course exists in Russia, but we have other demons, namely the oppositionary leaders. And what we are constantly searching for oppositionary leaders, hence the status of the foreign agent. You have probably heard about this, right? And also like the esoterical Russia, the whole magical part of how, okay, let me think about what I should say for you to understand. So if you watch Russian television, their propaganda is very mystical. They always talk about things that are completely like abstract and out of this world. So they're talking about like the greater good, some weird purposes, traditional values, Christianity, and not even in the way I talk about this right now. They use all of these super strange terms that are completely untranslatable, so I can't come up with that. So, but it does sound borderline cultish or just medieval, because this is how medieval people perceive the world. It's very Christian. It is very religious. It is very driven by abstract ideas, such as, for example, the apocalypse. And in Russia, when they're talking about the possibility of a nuclear war, what they say is like, we're going to go to heaven. And they're just going to die because they're blasphemous and sinners. And so, like, if that's not medieval, I don't really know what is. And this is why there's a lot of speculation on who is the ideological megaphone of the Russian system. Is it Dugin, for example? Is it someone else? There are so many other versions, but what you should really know about Dugin is that he is kind of influential, and he comes specifically from the esoteric occult circles. Those who know of his activities in the 80s and the 90s are familiar with that. And I guess every Russian who knows who Dugin is, he's kind of a meme in Russia due to his activities in the 80s and the 90s. But he's basically like this person who likes to listen to Coil. And there's one very funny story. Do you know the band under the name of Coil? John Balance and the esoterical underground of Great Britain. You have ever heard of that? You should Google this. Okay. I mean, it's interesting. So what about us? As a society in general, we have this colonial past and automized society. Atomized, not automized, obviously. Colonies are still here. So here's the thing with Russian colonies. Russia is a typical, well, maybe not so typical, but nonetheless, it is a European colonial empire. And the problem is that it is a colonial empire to this day. So while Great Britain, for example, went to the faraway lands and conquered these lands and tried to make them their colonies, what Russia did is would just grab the neighboring territories and like stitch, stitch, stitch. Now it's Russia. Stitch, stitch, stitch. Now it's Russia. So Russia got so bloated at some point, but also they were transferring these like ethnical Slavic people over these territories, and these people became residents of these territories and intermarried with like the local communities. So it's now literally like tearing the flesh. You can't just get rid of these colonies. Nonetheless, they are colonies and there are ethnical minorities there. And we are the dreadful white people for these people, you know. So we are living in the post-empire, but prior to the national state. Like I said, we have different parts. There's also a very interesting part, Chechnya, which is super enigmatic and super terrifying, and it is the ultimate feud. If there is any place in Russia that is the most feudal, it is Chechnya. You can also Google about this. I'm not going to talk about this for too long. And this is why we love to talk about unity, because there's no unity in Russia. And we like to make an impression of a unified country. Russian regions at war, I think I have already talked about how like they send people from certain regions. It's interesting how some of the political analytics started talking about this in the references of the greater houses in the war. When they're talking about the war, they're using all these references from Game of Thrones in Russian and Ukrainian, because they literally serve under the banners. So these people that are being mobilized, they're being taken to war against their will a lot of the times, just because they belong, they are subscribed to a certain region as if they're peasants. And then they're brought there, and sometimes the only person they know is their commander. They don't even know like who they are serving. And with the partial mobilization, it is the same. Like, you don't need to actually know where you're going, and you don't need to even, there's no way for you to even know that mobilization is not partial. Again, because the vertical society, these people don't understand that there is such thing as citizens. They don't care. And of course, some people want to be those who fight. And I think it's very important to understand that for modern Russia, being it so medieval or neo-medieval, people is a utilitarian thing, and they don't mean a thing. So it's, people serve the great idea, and this is the only thing that they can do. Or maybe not so great idea, but they nonetheless, they are a tool, okay? And then there's another concept that is tied back to propaganda, the idea of political immoralism, and how politics is immoral. Basically, all politics are bad, all governments are bad, they are unpredictable. If you think there's democracy there, you just don't know, you haven't been living there. It's just the same. And I guess this is being done on purpose in order to convince people that it is equally bad everywhere. So don't get there. Don't try to integrate. Don't try to somehow interact with the political system, because it's anyways all the same. Even if it looks democratic, it's still medieval in reality, right? So political immoralism is a very, in my opinion, it's a very dangerous concept, because not all politics is immoral. And we know that people, some activists, for example, who fight for their cause are not immoral. They're doing that because they believe in things that they believe in. And if you enforce this idea onto people that everybody who starts engaging in political activities is immoral and does that because it's their political games and we will never know the whole truth and all of these things, then of course, why will you be, dealing with anything like that and having anything with politics if it's so bad and immoral? You wouldn't. So then you lose the grip over the reality of your own country, and then you realize that you're in the midst of the mobilization, but there's nothing you can do about that. The last thing is, the illusion of modernity. We have talked about this already, but there's another funny thing that for a lot of people in Russia, when they go to meetings or protests or rallies, it's like a ritual, because who they're waiting for is the cops. If the cops don't show up, people are so amorphous at this point, and also they are so engaged in this idea of a peaceful protest that they don't know what to do. So here's the thing, again, this is important. I believe that people who live in this different timeline of the modern Russia and who believe in peaceful protest are not going to win the revolution. The common folk is going to. The common folk is very tolerant to violence due to Russian history, and they can probably get so angry, and they don't know all of these fancy words. They don't know what's intersectional feminism, and they don't ask each other's pronouns, but they know how to get very angry. And I'm not saying that people who ask each other's pronouns are particularly bad or there's something wrong with them. I'm just saying that these people believe that democratic mechanisms can be implemented. They cannot. And this is why when they venture out to the protest, usually they're just running in circles and trying to hide from the cops. And if the cops don't show up, they're just, standing there with their posters, and they don't have any goal. They don't have any particular end goal for this. They don't know how to occupy the square, for example, because they were not taught to do so. They were taught to run around with posters, which is okay for a democratic country, but do you really believe that such a regime that has started one of the bloodiest wars over the past couple of decades is going to just quit after seeing all of these people on the streets and oh, okay, they don't want us to be here, we're gonna go. Obviously, that's not going to happen. And it's funny how when I was talking to the lawyers recently, what they keep saying is that the law is over. If anything was kind of predictable prior to war, now the law is just completely there's no law, just forget about it. So yeah, another part of magical politology is that grassroots organizations are blasphemous in a way, and this is why demonomania is centered around oppositionary leaders and grassroots organizations. And it's because the king cannot have any grassroots common folk political opponent. It's crazy. It's a different class, right? So they don't take these people seriously, and once these people get prominent enough, like Navalny, they're just trying to kill them off. They can have opponents. For the common folk and for us, sometimes we really feel like God is more available than Putin. And it's funny how I saw some protesters from the regions that were, so there's this thing. So they're standing with the posters really far away from the city. And the journalist asks them why they do that. And they say, well, nobody can see us here now, but the sun came out of the cloud and saw us. So probably Putin is going to hear us. So this is, it's funny, and I see the Russians laughing because it's funny and it's mimetic, but, but like some people in some parts of Russia really get very much into this magical type of thinking because, you know, the more you try to communicate with governmental entities, the more you understand, like, the majority of this communication is just in vain. Like, you can't get anything out of it. The story of the shaman, you have probably heard of the shaman who goes with a crowd of like 8 or 7 people from one part of Russia to Moscow to kill Putin. He's been on his trip, on his journey, I don't know, he has his like fellowship and they're going to Kremlin to kill Putin. He was imprisoned, he was put to a psych ward, but now they let him loose and he's basically going to continue. And it was, the funniest thing about the shaman is you're laughing and I'm laughing, but what you don't understand is that people took it seriously. Not in a sense that, yeah, they actually believed that Putin is a demon. Of course not. Of course that's an exaggeration. But the fact that Putin thought that this person was dangerous and imprisoned him and then like sent him to the asylum, it says something about what's going on in modern Russia. Okay. It doesn't, yeah, can you help me? Why Russians don't protest? We're moving on to closer to the end. So there's this thing called the bystander's trauma. Can you please raise your hands if anyone heard of it? The bystander's trauma. So it's basically when you're witnessing a lot of violence, regardless of whether you're seeing this online or in media or you're actually like witnessing. So you can get like the PTSD and even complex PTSD out of just witnessing certain traumatic things, not being an active participant. So there's a lot of bystander's trauma for Russian people. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of political violence, and for those who were related to activism and activist fields, they've been witnessing this for the last like couple of decades. But on the other hand, violence does not surprise the majority of people. What I mean by that is that there is a certain level of violence that is acceptable by now. And even though people hate it, they kind of got used to living under this like pressure of violence and threat of violence. So unless we start doing something like that, they will probably not protest. But we're still humans though, and I guess that maybe the whole mobilization thing is going to turn the tables somehow. How does the game work? Yeah, so then we're moving on to the last part. So basically, Middle Ages is a meme in Russian internet. People keep reiterating how Russia is medieval, and 2 years ago, once, like I was just scrolling through the internet and just like looking at different posts, and I saw this meme again, and I was like, okay, but what if Russia is really medieval? What if I just take a closer look and try to find the most medieval events over the past couple of years and do something with that? And like I said, I used to engage in a lot of role-playing when I was like in the Tolkienist community, and I still kind of partially am like in my head. So since I am a nerd and I didn't play a lot of games, I played D&D obviously, and I played like actual like role-play games where you dress as an elf and like running around with a sword. I have friends who played a lot of computer games, and we came up with this idea of like a narration game, which is not exactly the game because it just is too time-consuming and resource-consuming. We didn't have like an opportunity because we didn't pay any money to anyone, you know, involved in the process. So we gathered these events. We had these like dark fantasy decorations for the events, and you're just the commoner who goes through the events and takes choices and stuff like that. And in the end, we thought that when we get you the results of your choices, for example, one of the results is you can get converted to the cop if you do all the wrong steps. And we wanted to get this feedback to you on your choices by removing the medieval decorations and showing you basically your email with all the letters that you receive as a result of your choices that look as if they are like legit actual letters from, for example, the FSB or your university or like your labor union, or depending on the choices that you made, depending on where it leads you, or maybe it's your application that you have installed, and the way that you installed it is kind of showing, like telling and stuff like that. So another reason why we use this is because like basically everything medieval related is deemed as escapist, and we wanted to engage in non-escapist practices by utilizing things that people usually use to escape reality. And we wanted to be like, okay, so we're doing this very like nerdy kind of role play-ish thing for the people who probably like medieval stuff and maybe like, you know, all of these like role play and things. But instead of pretending to be in Arda, what we're doing is like we're pretending to be in modern Russia, but not in modern Russia, but like in fantasy Russia, but it's real Russia. And we don't want you to play this game, we actually want you to pay attention to the events and actually see how you can make all of these actual choices in real life and end up in certain places, and how it's very, very important to understand that certain things just don't work. So we wanted to like basically adjust these escapist forms to non-escapist political activities. Also, a very important thing is that we live in history, and it's very, very obvious right now, but when we have started this game, this is also something that we wanted to show, that we live in historical events, and they are escalating, and it's very terrifying, actually, how many things we have like occasionally predicted in the game, even the war, and it's scary. We didn't mean to. But the fact is that when you live in history, it's actually just very annoying most of the time. So if you imagine any kind of a book that you're reading, like imagine that there's any kind of epic literature that you really like. It could be historical, could be fantasy, regardless. Now imagine what it's like to actually live in Westeros. Is it going to feel as if you're on adventure every single day, or is it going to feel as if it's like you're dragging some huge burden on your shoulders and you're just like, you're always hungry and there's plague and there are people dying and then it's boring, and then sometimes you have to travel to a different part of the world and it takes a lot of time, but most of the time you're just walking. So these things are both boring, terrifying, scary, annoying, depressing. This is what it feels like to live in historical events, regardless of what they show us in the movies, where they're like, oh, it's all action and it's all like friendship and then they save each other and blah, blah, blah. In reality, it's a prolonged process, right? So we wanted people to remove the decorations and realize that it's actually not a game. We are in historical events. What eventually happened is, yeah, it turns out it is indeed not a game. So we got rid of all the choices in the end of the game, because we thought that the only choice we had now after the beginning of war is the war, and everything, all the consequences now that we're going to have are going to be mutual and equal for all of us. And this is also the result of some of the choices we were making, not in the game, but in reality, because probably we could have stopped that, who knows, right? So we end this with a video, which is also an anti-war statement, instead of the choices, and a track that we have written specifically for the game. And this is the Instagram where you can see some of the videos, and this is like the official Instagram of the game. We haven't released it yet, again, because now the mobilization. We wanted to do it 2 days ago, but you know. And this is the thing that I want to leave you with. I don't know, very, very pretentious. But I actually think that the past belongs to the dead, and it doesn't belong to us. I mean, it does belong to us in the form of memories, but we should not live in the past, regardless of whether we like it or not, or enjoy it or not. So Putin, go away. I mean, go away to the past. You like the past so much that you literally want to return Russia before the schism. I don't want this, even though I'm somebody who really, really enjoys role plays. But I enjoy it, you know, like in a segmented reality, not like all the time, everywhere. So yeah, I want the future, and I want the future for Russia too. Thank you so much.
So as we were prepared and we were expecting, it was a lot of information and a lot of narratives touched upon, and I'm sure you must have some questions, maybe not even one or two. What should we start with?
If you have any, of course. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. I was just wanting to know what you thought about you've obviously spoken how Russians and how Putin is perceiving Russia at the moment and making a link to this neo-feudalism. But I was wondering if there's any similarities between how Russians and how the state propaganda is perceiving the West and countries like Britain and America, and how their relations with them. Is there any link that can be made to the neo-feudalism?
No, I don't think. Like I said, I don't believe that everything that happens in Russia is neo-feudal. I believe that, like, we have touched upon propaganda a little bit here, and we talked about how it's very, like, it consists of so many different, like, iterations and facets that it's hard to unify this in one, like, structure. But I think that there is this thing that we talked about that is demonomania, and like the search for the influence and the whole like blasphemous craze where people are looking for the blasphemy. I think it could be tied to the idea of the influence, because why Russia is afraid, like why Russian propagandists are afraid of Britain, not specifically because they are the Western countries, but because they're afraid that there are some Western values that can like infiltrate the Russian society. Which is funny because it has already happened. And I mean, also, what are the Western values? Like, I mean, I just don't like this. I believe that, first of all, like historically, I believe that Russia is a European country. I mean, technically it is. It's like, Kiev and Rus was not spread onto the territory of Eurasia. It was particularly in Europe, and it was the country of white Slavic people, then Christian Slavic people. And the fact that Russia wants to invent its own separate path is an imperialistic complex, of course, because I mean, Japan did the same, and Germany at some point did the same, and talked a lot about how they have their own like separate path and whether they're going to take Austria onto this path with them. And then they had the Second World War, you know. So, and then the separate special path of Germany was over for, I mean, and it's a good thing. So, I feel like, yeah, you can probably tie certain things to medieval concepts as well, but like I said, this is more, I like talking about this, and I like speculating, and I like to tie this to the symbolic concept of the game, but I'm not saying that this is particularly the way it is, like 100% truth, and you should take it as, you know, whatever, as gospel, and just basically say this is true.
How much in danger are you or your friends and your friends to by playing this game and by publishing what you've been?
Sorry, I can hear you. Can I? Oh my God, I'm sorry. I'm gonna come closer.
How much in danger are you and your colleagues by making this game public?
This is why we left the country, one of the reasons. Like, not the major reason, but one of the reasons. Sure, of course, it's dangerous, because it talks about all of these things, like you can imagine.
So who did you talk to?
What do you mean, who did I talk to?
By who did you talk to I meant, like, did you interview Russians online, or did you interview Russians on the phone?
No, we did interview some of the Russians, but we didn't. We took the events that were publicly known. Mm-hmm. We just collected the things that we partially participated in, some of the protests, some of the events, some of the situations, some of the things. And we did talk to certain people. For example, when we were working on the Chechnya region, we did talk to people from that region. Not particularly on the events, but more like on the events that we have written, and then how they gave us feedback, and they have like corrected us and told us how to do that, and what is, in their opinion, the most important thing about Chechnya in the context of neo-feudalism. So, but we have collected the things that were like on the surface. It's just that nobody ever analyzed them in this matter. But like, you know, these are not the things that we specifically got from the people. I used to work a lot on the projects, and I was an organizer and the founder of certain projects that were heavily relying on the interviews with people and direct communication with them, as art activists love to do. But I got a little bit tired at the point of that, and while I was also engaging in a lot of like paralleled processes that involved a lot of communications with people, we did not do this in this project. But with my colleague Katrina Nenasheva, for example, while we were working on our plays and performances, usually, yes, we work directly with the stories of actual real people.
Thank you.
More questions?
just want to say thank you because I like really weird and really cool. But I was just wondering, so you mentioned that like Russia, the way it is now, is still in some forms, a lingering empire with, little bits of different ethnicities kind of clumbered on. And I wanted to know, in your like personal opinion, what would you like this geographical territory that is now called Russia to look like in 50 years? And it's just...
I would like it to get rid of the idea of a special path. It's hard for me to imagine anything exact, but I believe that a lot of other European countries, and not only European, like Japan, for example, have underwent kind of seemingly the same processes in terms of like readjusting themselves to the new realities and understanding that imperialism is not the way, it just doesn't work anymore. And the idea that Russia is the sacred, separate, absolutely different from the rest of the world type of country, I feel like it doesn't benefit Russia. Because I don't feel that I'm so different from you. But when I talk to, like, I have a lot of foreign friends, like obviously I have a lot of conversations, especially with Americans. And sometimes, they horrify me when they're talking about Russians, because even though they're talking to me, they don't really perceive me as Russian. Because, I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm a translator. I do a lot of like international work. I mean, like my occupation, I'm a simultaneous translator. And like, due to that reason, there's almost this like division between somebody like me and somebody who's a real Russian, who's not supposed to speak English, who's not supposed to, have tattoos and do this and that. And it's crazy and strange because it's not only Putin that alienates Russian citizens, but also other people that are just reflecting and internalizing this approach and like basically reiterating his concepts and like repeating them. And I feel like the separate, special, sacred path has to go.
I think I would ask one question too. You started talking about it, and I think in general that's a question that is being asked a lot. You've mentioned this intense centralization, and on the other hand, this diversity.
Yeah, contradictory processes.
Yeah, and ethnocentrism in some regions and silence national identities in other regions. How do you think it's gonna fuel the current narrative? And is there any ways to vocalize anything on the basis of self-identification right now, nowadays, especially after the news about global mobilization in Russia?
So I have a really strange idea. So I believe that, first of all, the rise of national movements and even borderline nationalistic movements, ethnical movements in the regions is very important. Because these are the first people who don't want to play the imperialistic game anymore. But I also feel like it's very important for the ethnical Russians or ethnical Slavs, whoever refers to himself as such or herself as such or themselves as such, to understand that imperialism does not benefit ethnical Russians as well. And it's true because Russians, despite being the title nation, despite being the language of the empire, using their language as language of the empire, despite having the capital in the Russian city of Moscow, they are tools. Nobody cares about Russians specifically. So the longer Russian people continue on believing that the imperialistic Putin's ideas are benefiting them somehow because of the greater good, the problem will remain, and it will be very hard for them to be in solidarity with the ethnical minorities. And if you look at the history of Russia, for example, at the history of collectivization, and you see what happened with the Russian peasantry, how the majority of Russian peasants were just killed off in the collectivization process, and then the Great Terror, and all of these things influenced greatly, specifically Russian ethnical culture. I mean, not only, but Russian ethnical culture as well. So the Soviet Union and the everything that was taking place in Soviet Union, both good and bad, like horrible and great, these things were never aimed at people because it was not a socially oriented country in the modern sense, like for example, the Scandinavian countries, right? But also it was targeting in a very bad way, in the worst sense of the word. It was targeting Russian people just as much as it was targeting ethnic minorities. The only difference is that, yes, they utilized Russian language and Russian culture to utilize it as a weapon and a tool against ethnic minorities, while also killing thousands of Russians. And this is, you know, the contradiction that these people have to wrap their minds around and completely understand what that means. So imperialism is not the way. And I feel like not nationalist, but like national independence movements that are on the rise right now and anti-war movements are going to be very helpful in this process. Does that make sense?
It does, but I just want to follow up and then we'll see if there are any more questions. But we see very clearly recent decades, years, centuries, this focus on like Russian identity, right?
Yeah, but is it really a focus on Russian identity?
It's twisted.
It is twisted because imagine that we have an organization under the name of Memorial that is dedicated to Russian political prisoners and the victims of the terror. And this organization is being prosecuted. Are they really concentrating on the Russian identity? So this is the question that should be utilized in counter-propaganda, in my opinion.
But yes, but we see how it can be twisted and turned upside down.
Yeah, of course, and that's what they're doing.
It is working in this really like disastrous way, way too well sometimes. How we would be able, or who is in charge for turning it around?
I don't know. I guess not me, but
just an idea, because you engaged in the project, right? You're like
yeah.
one of the authors of the project that invites people to reflect on this.
I think unified forces of counter-propaganda, activist groups, grassroots resistance that spread alternative information. But it's going to be a gradual process. I think that all of these like analytical things are going to take place after the revolution. The revolution will be fueled by just sheer anger of people who were deprived of their like basic human needs. And it's not the time for rambling, I guess. And it's a very complex concept. People have to dwell on it for a while. And I think that it's obviously better to do that after everything is over and after we're done with the regime.
So you see there's some revolutionary movements as the primal way to get out of this narrative of like being
I don't
superior.
believe that there is an opportunity, like I said, I feel like the regime is going to collapse and there are a couple of options as to how this might happen. For example, there might be a certain like inner tension within the silovые структуры, and then we get another president who is no better than Putin. But there could be a revolution as well if people get super fed up. And what should fuel this kind of revolution is obviously not the question of organizations like Memorial or the far past. It's the present. We should concentrate on the present. Putin talks about the past all the time. We should concentrate on the present. The present is Putin let us down. I never believed in Putin, but if you want to go out to these people, to venture out to them and to try to convince and persuade them, he let you down. Your son is going to war. He said it's going to be stable. He said it's going to be secure. He said the havoc of the 90s. We didn't have any wars. I mean, we did have some wars in some regions, but we didn't have like total, utter mobilization in the 90s, right? So, and nobody was threatening us with radioactive ash in the 90s.
So as some people say, the worse the better.
The worse the better?
Yeah.
Who says this? I don't know, it's interesting.
There is this like, widely spread
Well, I mean, it's a joke. Чем хуже, тем лучше. It's like a meme. It's not. I mean, I don't think people say that like in all seriousness.
I'm by no means serious right now, but it looks like this. Any more questions, maybe? So maybe we should wrap up on this revolutionary note. It's kind of notable. Thank you so much, Sasha.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Let's
Yeah.
wait.